If we combined everything that we know about the devil, it's easily sufficient to implicate Satan as the grand deceiver. When we couple that with Revelation 12 and 20, it's sufficient evidence to connect him with the crime committed in Genesis 3. But that's not really the question at hand, is it? The ultimate question is whether there was a literal serpent involved in the incident, and if so, to what degree it participated. So let's talk about that. Does the curse need to be applied to a literal serpent? On your belly you shall go, and the dust you shall eat all the days of your life. If we apply that to a literal serpent, as I mentioned above, it would be nice to have some evidence that serpents were capable of walking or flying, and then were cursed to crawl on their bellies. Also, since they don't currently reason morally or speak, we'd need to apply that the curse was more than dealing with their physical characteristics. I suppose we could say that the curse applied only to the one serpent, but that's not consistent with the curses applied to the earth, Adam, and Eve. That brings me to the question, could the curse apply to a spiritual being operating in the garden? Well, let's look at a few places in the Old Testament we find the phrase, lick the dust, which is very similar to the dust you shall eat. Psalm 72:9, may desert tribes bow down before him, and his enemies lick the dust. Isaiah 49:23, kings shall be your foster fathers, and their queens your nursing mothers. With their faces to the ground they shall bow down to you and lick the dust of your feet. Micah 7:17, they shall lick the dust like a serpent, like the crawling things of the earth. So the curse found in Genesis could be symbolic of absolute humiliation, and therefore the intent could be to express humbling something figuratively. Now, we could apply this literally, which has often been done. For example, we do see serpents crawling on their bellies, and this is how I interpret the eating dust part if we're literally applying it to serpents. Since their food source is in the dust, i.e. mice and other things, then when they attack their prey, that creature is in the dust. Not to mention that serpents flick out their tongues and figuratively or literally lick the dust as they flick their tongues out, although that's not their intention. So we can see how in a figurative type sense that could apply directly to a literal serpent. Okay. Now, one popular theory that people pose is that Satan took the form of a serpent in order to beguile Eve. Okay. I've always had a few questions. If that is the case, then I feel like it implies a few things, and I'm just going to share those things with you here. It seems to imply familiarity. We're talking about a talking snake here with the ability to reason morally. And Adam named every creature. He would have known if animals, specifically the Nakash, could speak. If the creature couldn't speak or reason morally, then in my opinion, that should have raised some questions that would have appeared in Genesis chapter 3. Regardless of if we're talking about a literal serpent or that Satan utilized, or if we're talking about Satan taking the form of a serpent. After all, this serpent, this being, challenged God's command to the face of those Adam and Eve that were given authority over the earth and all of the creatures of the earth. If Satan disguised himself as that serpent, then it requires us to interpret the curse in 14 figuratively applying only to Satan, because it wouldn't make sense to curse literal serpents if he took the form of one and did the beguiling. Another way of reconciling the text is by saying that Satan used a serpent for his purposes, and we're going to talk about that again. It implies serpents, at least one special serpent, could speak. I mean, they weren't surprised by a talking serpent. This seemed normal to them. Eve is even willing to carry on a conversation despite the fact that the serpent is seemingly tricking her or challenging God's word. And then you have to ask, the serpent was so cunning that it was able to reason morally, even to the point of deceiving or beguiling Eve, who knew the command of God. So where does this bring us? Well, we have overwhelming evidence to place Satan in the garden, and we can pronounce him guilty of being manipulative, deceiving, a murderer, and a liar, among many other things. His nature is consistent with one who would tempt humanity's first humans to disobey God. After all, this is exactly what we find him doing in Matthew chapter 4 in the New Testament, as he is tempting the Christ. What else do we know? Well, serpents, at least in modern day, do not speak or have the intellect to reason morally. Did the curse somehow strip them of intellect, communication, and the ability to speak? The serpent's mentioned once alone by Paul, as I mentioned in the New Testament, whereas the Apostle John calls Satan that ancient serpent. Notice he didn't say an ancient serpent, or he was like that ancient serpent, making it a simile. No. He specifically identifies Satan with the serpent as if they were one and the same being. Did Satan somehow use a serpent to beguile Eve? Although and we mentioned that above, but although it's not without some serious complications, it cannot be entirely ruled out. And the second question is, did Satan somehow transform himself into a serpent and beguile Eve? Again, it's not without complications, but I wouldn't rule it out completely. In fact, if I were only given the two options, it would make a lot more sense to say that Satan somehow transformed himself into a snake. Eve was not surprised by this. She was willing to have a conversation with this being. That is much more consistent with Satan being the ultimate deceiver. We could then take the curse in verse 14 and apply it entirely to Satan and eliminate a literal serpent that needed to reason morally and speak. Still, the issue I have is that Eve is carrying on a conversation with a serpent that seems apparently normal to her. So why would Satan take the form of a serpent to trick her unless she was already intimately familiar with these serpents and they could speak and reason morally? I'm just not sure. So before we conclude, I would like to point out perhaps an alternative theory as to why this literal serpent was in the garden and able to have a conversation. Like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus of Lyons, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, among others, I see Satan as the literal agent behind the deception, a fact, in my opinion, made easy by John's writings in Revelation 12 and Revelation 20. But the question is, did Satan disguise himself as a serpent? Well, that is the ultimate question, isn't it? And again, although it's not outside the realm of possibility, let me suggest there could be an alternate view which I believe could clarify the issue. What if the being we know as Satan is literally a spiritual serpent or appears as one? You may ask, well, doesn't that contradict the Bible? Well, let's have a look. Job 1:6 says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them." It does not imply that Satan is a son of God in the sense of the angelic beings, but that he came with them. Matthew 25:41, "Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you cursed, into eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels.'" The devil has angels associated with him, but is not directly called one. So isn't the association with the angels enough to suggest he is one? Well, I think we'd have to really take a strong look at Revelation 12 and 20 to make that claim. Revelation 12:7 says, "Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back." I think the passage which most strongly gives us the impression that he's an angel is found in 2 Corinthians 11:14. And it says, "And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light." Does this imply Satan is an angel? Let's take a closer look. If we were looking at this only from an English language perspective, we'd find a figure of speech called a simile employed utilizing a like or an as statement to compare one thing with another. But it goes beyond that in the Greek, and it suggests a literal transformation in appearance has taken place, although not an inward change. And that is precisely how it's used in the few times that it's employed in the Greek New Testament. Before we wrap this up, I should mention that some see passages that we find in Ezekiel 28, primarily verses 11 through 16, which references the king of Tyre, as actually referring to a spiritual being, namely Satan. Now, this is because the language in Ezekiel 28:14 is very difficult to attribute to a human ruler, making some view the being in question as Satan, and others making everything allegorical or using figures of speech to try to explain the drastic shift from talking to the prince of Tyre to the king of Tyre. Now, here's some highlights of those passages. It says, "You were the signet of perfection. You were full of wisdom and beauty." It says, "You were in the garden of God, Eden," or in Eden, the garden of God. It calls the king of Tyre the anointed guardian cherub. It says that he was blameless in his ways until, and then it says at the end there, "O guardian cherub," and it goes on to say something that God did to him as a form of punishment. For our purposes, let's assume this is talking about the spiritual being we know as Satan, and if it is, then he's called a cherub. Now, I didn't have this in my notes, but some people will connect the cherub with the seraphs, and they will mention that seraphs could be fiery type serpentine beings, although again, I'm not necessarily making that connection. I'm just telling you that some people do reconcile what they think is referring to Satan as a cherub with perhaps a seraph, which is more of a serpentine being. I'm not going that route. I just would like to mention, if you're not familiar with cherubs, these are extraordinary beings, which we read about in the book of Ezekiel and Isaiah, and they're certainly not angelic, at least in the sense that we traditionally view angels. Does this passage, if indeed it does refer to Satan, eliminate the possibility of Satan being a spiritual serpentine type being? Well, not necessarily. You see, the Septuagint version of this text says, "You were with the cherub who was anointed, and I placed you among the stones of fire." Very similar, but the LXX Septuagint does not imply that he is a cherub, but rather he was placed with a cherub in a specific place, leaving open the door for him being some other type being. Now, although I can't guarantee you that LXX is the most accurate translation in this instance, as I mentioned, it would, if we are indeed dealing with Satan, possibly give us an explanation for him being something other than a cherub. So, where does this bring us, and does it benefit us if Satan is literally a spiritual being that resembles a serpent? Well, yes, in some ways. It could explain why Eve and Adam nearby were talking with a serpent, as he's called, the Nakash, and seemingly unbothered by a talking, morally reasoning serpent. But it would require, and this is an inference on my part, that Adam and Eve were familiar with spiritual beings of potentially different appearances from themselves. Were they familiar with messengers or angels? Were they familiar with cherubs? Were they familiar with seraphs? It's impossible to say for sure, although we do know in Genesis 3:24 that cherubim were placed at the entrance to guard the way to the tree of life. Adam and Eve could have potentially seen them at that point, but it doesn't say that they saw spiritual beings earlier. Serpents can't presently reason morally or speak, so we'd have to say, if we're dealing with literal serpents, that the curse in Genesis 3:14 implies much more than going from standing upright, perhaps, or crawling, or flying, to on its belly, and then it applies to every other serpent. Now, we could say, if it's Satan directly in a serpentine type form, that it applies directly to his humiliation. What else do we gain? Well, it would help explain Revelation 12 and 20, where Satan is called that ancient serpent. Now, again, he is literally the one doing this even in the garden, according to Revelation that John got. So, can we conclude that there wasn't a literal serpent? No, I'm sorry, but I'm not prepared to say that. But I have listed the complications I find with having a literal serpent. So if we're between that or Satan taking the form of a serpent, I think it much more likely that he took the form of a serpent, although that still does not, in my opinion, explain some of the challenges presented by the text, although I do think it's a much more fair evaluation of the text than thinking that a literal serpent could speak and reason morally and side with Satan. That just doesn't seem as consistent with what we see presently. So lastly, can we conclude that Satan is not an angelic being and could perhaps be more serpentine in appearance? Not for certain, but the Bible does not in any instance ever call him an angel. It could imply that he's a cherub. However, depending on the usage of the Masoretic text or the Septuagint text, which by the way was 300 years before Jesus, him and his disciples did quote it frequently. That's the text they had available. In that text, it does not imply that he is a cherub, but that he was with the cherub. So we do have some room there, and I do think that if we explain that he is a serpentine-esque spiritual type being, it does align much more closely with Revelation 12 and 20. Okay, so after a lot of debate and conversations and study and just poring over this text over and over and over, this is it. This is the best I have for you. I wish I could give you a conclusive answer, but this is as close as I think I can get to reconciling what we see with the Genesis text with that supernatural being that we know as Satan, who is the deceiver of the whole world. So thank you so much for watching. Until next week, may the Lord bless us with a more fuller, deeper, richer understanding of him as we study his word.